It's up to you. She's gonna go live on YouTube and Facebook.
I know on the way over.
Oh, okay, great. Did you start it already, Naja?
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so you're going live on Facebook? Okay. You want some extra points?
Sure.
Sit beside her and go live and don't let her fidget.
All right. Pass around the sign sheet, everybody. Please sign your name and your position as student faculty.
You good? Is it focused? Can you see me and that?
Go ahead and sign.
Sorry. It's okay.
Thank you. Without glasses.
Oh, wait a minute. You want me to wave to the people watching?
Yes, please. Thank you. Oh, they're already watching?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, Willie's on there. Okay.
I don't know if the microphone is on.
Really, Naja?
Oh wait, it is
Yes, the
on.
microphone is on.
Thank you.
Naja, can you look how it looks like? So you need to put her in to the center.
I think that one's the
Oh,
one.
you already did.
Because I moved it. Yeah, it's like a couple minutes. I'm good. Yeah, I did. Like, did you find me excited? It was literally she's like, I was just like, I wonder if she's coming.
Now you're
I haven't seen him forever.
Should we start to be respectful of it this time?
All right, y'all, going ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming out to our table talk. This is our last table talk of the semester. Table talks are our graduate series where we allow graduate students to have the opportunity and space to present their research, to get feedback and to hear your all's thoughts. We do encourage the presenter to ask for any specific feedback that they're looking for throughout the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get started. And this is Jolivette.
Thank you. Do we ever really begin at the beginning? So, Charlie, where will you begin? They say it's best to begin at the beginning, but I don't know if that's possible. There is no true beginning. I have to pick a point to start from. So you're going to begin with God. No, my dear. I won't be telling this crowd that my dissertation begins with God. I don't think they will receive it very well. Why? Why you say that? Because it sounded to me like you just said everything is the same. If there ain't no beginning, there ain't no ending either. I don't know what that sounds like to you, but it sounds like God to me. Because then I would have to explain what we mean by God. I would have to describe and define everything, and not everybody believes what we believe. They don't believe what we was raised to believe. So they ain't got to believe a dadgum thing when it comes to what is actually happening around them. Some things just is. So my dissertation is not about God. It's about you. Well, it begins with you and your writings, and you and your mama and your daddy and your granddaddies and everybody on Ledbetter Street and everybody in the Hollywood neighborhood. Yeah, I know. My dear, so you saying God kept all of us alive and made a way out of no way for folk to move from nothing to something? No, that ain't what I'm saying. Sound like that's what you say, because that is what you seem to think God did. That wasn't God picking cotton in the Louisiana heat. That was me and your mama and your papa and a whole lot of other black folk from our spot in the world. I'm saying that tell them what God is in a way they can understand how they fit into the grand scheme of things. And you ain't never got to use the word God while you're talking. They ain't got to believe what you believe about who made things or who running things, but they do got to acknowledge that they sitting there listening to what you're saying. If they can't acknowledge they self, then you might not be in the schoolhouse. You might be in the nut house, and you need to get away from there lest you become crazy too. What I'm saying is that if they there in the flesh, something came before them to get them there, and something will come after. And how we make sense of what that means, hey, he there too. He, my dear, God is a he. Yeah, of course God is a he. And God is a she too. Really? I never heard you say that before. Daddy and Papa would disagree, don't you think? Perhaps. But they know better than to try that and get away with it with something like that with you. When they saw their own smartness coming to the world as a girl, they had to go on ahead and shut up, humble themselves, and make room. Make room? Make room for what? Make room for what we women folk do and been doing since the beginning of time. Make room for our being included into the work being done in the world. Make room for being part of how we see things and understand things. Make room for not who God is, but what God is. There is no God without woman. It just ain't possible. And you believe this, but never spoke it till now? Why? To keep the peace. Mine, his, and the world's. Can you imagine if us women folk had gone around claiming 50% of what God is? You might not have never been born. And if you would have been born, you wouldn't have had the benefit of knowing a certain kind of balance, a certain kind of peace. Men folks seem to need to believe they're in charge of everything. That's just one part of that beast inside of them. So we let them think what they needed to think just to keep the peace. We always knew it was not just he or she. We knew it was always we. So I will begin where my story begins. No, I will begin where our story begins. And just pick a place and a space on our Black cultural continuum. It was Sunday, October 27, 2019. I woke up to relieve myself in the bathroom. While sitting there, the thought, the understanding came through. Not either or, not both and. It had to be self as other. On this question of subject and object and how we exist in space and time, I found a deep need inside Black spaces for self-critique and how we are in the world and how we came to be disregarded as non-contributors to the respectable commentary of history, as John Henry Clark says. Upon rushing to my notebook while stumbling over laundry and other clutter in my apartment. I hit my cell phone to check the time. It was 8:08 a.m. I grabbed my pen and wrote self as other. I had been reading and lecturing on the introductions to White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, and fallen in love with these writings as a way to teach and learn with my students. I had not read the classics. I had read the most recent Eisenberg text years ago. However, it was Toni Morrison's foreword to The Bluest Eye that kicked me in the gut. I had not read The Bluest Eye in over 20 years and had not remembered the words of Morrison's foreword to the text. In it, she is being unapologetic about not explaining the codes embedded in Black culture to her readers. So, as I am rereading White Trash, I am reading the absence of Blackness. As I am reading The Feminine Mystique, I am reading the absence of Blackness, as with the other text, until Richard Wright is mentioned. I traveled down the rabbit hole and located Lorraine Hansberry in this conversation, and possibly Margaret Walker Alexander as well. Though I have built into my course Black women writers like Nikki Skies, Barbara Ramsey, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and Toni Morrison for this semester, and Roxane Gay and Marlo David in previous semesters, the fact that I had to make room for them became an issue. It is not automatic to structure the course that way, just as it was not automatic for me to position my grandmother, my mothers at the center of my thoughts and to credit them with my becoming a woman. I would even wrestle with my disagreements with my parents once I became an adult. I would fight against my dad's thoughts about womanhood, but I would blame my mother for her thoughts about womanhood and the kind of woman I became. Coming out of the rabbit hole of connections to Blackness via Black people and our proximity to white women whose works are deemed classics in feminist writings, I had to make the all too familiar, I need some money this week, phone call to my brother. This happened on the Saturday before. While on the phone with him, my college friend and colleague call, in full disclosure, it is Nikki Skies, whom I mentioned earlier. She is wrestling with the should I PhD or should not PhD decision. Age, raising 3 girls, wanted to be a creative and not an academic because one is definitely better for her health than the other. Somehow, we started talking about Barbara Ann Teer and her work during and beyond the Black arts movement. Teer, was a theorist, operated the National Theater of Harlem, and taught theater rooted in ritual, African ritual practices, and those practices were evident and obviously in my understanding of what I was reading about her African ritual practices, and those practices were evident and obviously in my understanding of what I was reading about her had been preserved in the Baptist church and how I grew up worshiping. These thoughts was a circle completing itself. I could feel it. The connections were there. I had also been reading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, Our Kin by Carol Stack, Still Brave by James Foster and Shefdal. A quick Google search found Miss Teer, but through the works of August Wilson, being described and defined by Paul Carter Harrison. Harrison quotes Northrop Frye on mythology, and he quotes philosopher Lucius Outlaw on the integrity of Black culture, and Harrison on symbolic reversal of social and sacred codes for the transformation of consciousness. The commentary on the transformation of consciousness led me back to Beauvoir and her lover, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the argument that she developed of her own philosophical ideas about subjectivity and objectivity before she met Sartre, but credits him with her deeper philosophical understandings of it. These thoughts led me to literally look up from my notebook to see a book titled Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit sitting on my desk in my apartment. A book I had purchased on March 31st, 2012, because I wrote it in the book, but I had not read it yet. I began reading it ferociously, off and on for hours. It got me here today to these thoughts I am sharing and will share with you over the next 20 minutes or so. But he, Hegel, and others, it's not the end all and be all. There were philosophers, philosophical thoughts before and after Hegel that must be acknowledged here today and in my work. Moving forward, from the past to the present and beyond the present, the ideas of liberation hum over, under, and throughout my work. Specific to the question of liberation are the acts of liberation I have witnessed in my life and in a document my grandmother left for me. Her life and mine expressed deeply and without apology some aspects of the Leonard Harris philosophy of liberation in its extended form of insurrectionist ethics that has been in play along with what I call a Black cultural continuum, which is the generational inheritance of Black struggle, as I use the term, and it has two forms of inheritance. One, inheritance from individual and collective voices and acts of existence, not resistance, but acts of existence in submission as a form of resistance. Number two, inheritance by an individual or collective progeny and our acts of existence, intentional existence. That generational struggle is present in my blood kin and extended kinship ties. My work gives an insider's perspective not only as an object, but as subject, as a continuation of Black struggle who has inherited and who will leave an inheritance, as I hope to leave to my daughter, Naja, who I dedicate this presentation to. My rudimentary understanding of insurrectionist ethics asks the question, does the slave have an ethical responsibility or an ethical obligation to liberate herself from oppression? It is here that I move from the philosophical to the practical. The philosophical would debate and discuss the question without moving into an answer to the question. Here, I venture to not only answer the question, but to show you through my writings of my grandmother and how they too answered the question and over generations taught me how to answer that question based on how we exercise agency over our lives. Under these United States conditions, the question asked has not been if we should kill what oppresses us. The question has been how we should kill what oppresses us. The next logical thought process at this point then is to identify what has historically oppressed Black people. My work identifies the what in what oppresses us as the conditions under which we have been forced to struggle through to sustain our lives and pass down an inheritance, material and spiritual, to our progeny. How have we responded? How have we fought back? How have we ventured into war against Black oppression in the United States? What are our ideas, thoughts, strategies, and practices toward various types of confrontation on various fronts, tangible and intangible? My grandmother's journal answers the question of how we should kill what oppresses us within the first few pages. On this page in particular, she writes, January 2nd, 1949, we moved to Shreveport to Hollywood Avenue. Helen and them start to school, January 3rd, 1949. March 11, we move in our own house, paid Reverend Williams $5 on the house. January 8, 1949, Willie and Goldleana bought a lot, cost $450, paid $150, leave us owing $300. February 1, 1949, paid $60 on our lot, leave us owing $41.60. Paid $70, paid out July 1, paid for it, paid for the lot out. March 21, 1949, I was hired to the chair factory. Start to work March 22, 1949. Will got hired at Kenrod, March 21, 1949. July 16, I went out home and start a week of canning up 130 cans and jars of fruit. August 27, 1949, I bought a radio for $19.50. August 23rd, I started picking cotton. The first 4 days, I made $20.40. Next 3 days, $25.90. Next 3 days, $23.95. Next week, I made $44.45. Next week, I made $44.40. Next week, I made $12.60. Next week, I made $45.45. The next week, I made $15.95. The next week, I made $12.60. The next week, I made $7.50. The next week, I made $20.40. As you look up here, this says October 23rd, 1950, Mrs. Goldleana wrote about our day at the fair. Upon further research, our meant Negro or colored people day at the fair. This is in Shreveport, Louisiana. Here you can see October 23rd was our day at, and then the pages got torn off. Right here, the next line says we went to the fairground. This is an article that I found from 1955, Negro Day at the Fair. I also found some posters that say 1940, Negro Day at the Fair in Shreveport, Louisiana. What is interesting about this particular article that you may not be able to see or understand at this moment is that it says that it was the Parade of Progress Day. And it mentions that certain Negro schools had agreed to participate in the fair. So they marched through downtown up Texas Street, which is one of the main streets downtown. It says Grambling College's band will lead the parade this year because it was the first unit to accept an invitation to participate in the event. That is now Grambling State University, historically Black college and university in Louisiana. I received my first master's from Grambling State University. 36 bands have been invited to participate, and State Fair officials expect most of them to accept by the entry deadline. The parade will be in the downtown Shreveport beginning at 10 a.m. The parade was first staged 5 years ago. 5 years ago would have been 1950. This is a picture of Ernest Mosley, age 12, Rosie Mosley, age 9, and Helen Mosley, age 10. In the order, this is Helen right here. And this is Negro Day at the Fair in Louisiana in 1950. This is the day, this is a picture that documents what my grandmother wrote in her journal about our day at the fair. And she made a point to take her children to the fair. Mind you, they had just relocated 1949, January of 1949, from rural Louisiana into the city of Shreveport. And so she was trying to give her children experiences and opportunities to do things as well. Full disclosure, I am the progeny of Helen. That is my mother. How did we fight oppression? How did we attempt to kill oppression? We chose to kill the oppression and not to make attempts to kill the oppressors. We did not believe in that. That violated our principles and our values to even think in that way. Step one, we move, we migrate, we leave. The implication is we leave what is not working and seek out a place or space where things can be better for us. Step two, we get schooling, we learn. The implication is we educate ourselves, starting with the children, and the children can sometimes teach the older folks how to read and write and cipher. These were rural folks moving into the city, and some could not read and write until well into adulthood. Step three, we get housing, we make a home, we live. The implication here is get your own home if you can. It is best to have your own and not to have to live with other people. It's best to own your own and not rent. Step four, we labor, we work. She got hired at the chair factory. He got hired at Kenmore Lumber Yard, which was around the corner from the street that they lived on. And when they, Step five, we worship our liberty, okay? The implication here is that we always understand that there's something bigger than us, and we try to practice not just church on Sunday, but the principles that are talked about in church, we try to live them every single day of our lives and with every breath that we breathe. We play, we have activities, we have leisure time. What we do with our leisure time is crucial. I say it's crucial because it leaves an imprint. It's that part of that hidden curriculum that's inside of the practices of how Black people were actually living in these segregated spaces. And who knows? The image that I showed you when my mother was 10 years old at the fair and her possibly attending Negro Day at the fair and seeing all those marching bands, perhaps that motivated her to go to attend Wiley College, where she was a majorette for the band. And when she came out of Wiley with that Booker T philosophy, actually, that I heard about from Sister Doctor yesterday, that was present in Shreveport during that time, pushed her to also go back into the neighborhood she came out of and to start several marching bands for neighborhood children. So we lived in the community of Hollywood, and so she started the Hollywood High Steppers, which was a marching group. So our young kids in the neighborhood could have extracurricular activities outside of school, and that were wholesome activities. And that was one of the goals and her missions that she set out to do. So whatever she inherited from my grandmother, she also put it into motion. And she also passed it down to me. And it is my job to pass it down to mine. Step 7, we exist. Still. We live. And the goal is to stay alive, to build on that inheritance that we have been given. Segregated by race. The Hollywood neighborhood is a physical location geographically. It is also a spiritual location that exists in the consciousness of the people that have lived experiences there. Our mothers, our Black mothers, exist in a physical location. They too exist in a spiritual location inside of our consciousness, yet within and outside of a Western consciousness. Deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian mythos or narratives is a practice of an alternative African mythos, the origin narrative where what I am calling the Black feminine resided. She is a consciousness that expresses herself as a racialized pronoun of we and our, to demarcate the Black feminine experience, also called the Africana woman experience, inside of the Western geographic, philosophic, cultural, and psychic space that I will call Western consciousness. Her use of we and our speaks to her past, her present, and her progeny. Therefore, she speaks in what I call the Progenic Voice. Before I move forward, this is a quote from Ira Berlin on Place. Between the Great Migration stood periods of deep rootedness. Movement might be omnipresent in the African American experience between the 16th and 21st centuries, but so too has been a sense of place. There's a story to be told here about we who remained in the South. We who did not migrate. We who held it down for those who left in case they needed to come back and for other reasons. This is what a house could look like. This house still in the community. It's called a shotgun house. This is what the house could possibly look like when people were migrating from the rural into the city of Shreveport. Eventually, a house like this would get built up to look like this, because people were constantly laboring and adding on and so forth and so on to make this dirt lot that they bought turn into something that they could be proud of, that they were it was their home. It was where their living took place. It was where they set rules and regulations for themselves and others. And much of those rules and regulations were guided by something bigger than us, and also things that were tangible and intangible that they may not have talked about at the time. Also, other institutions were in place. Black businesses in our neighborhood. Eddie's restaurant is still in the neighborhood. Shrimp is being carried on by his children and his grandchildren. The Hollywood Church of God in Christ is also still in the neighborhood. My mama's marching group is not in the neighborhood. She passed away, but this is an example of the marching group that she started in the neighborhood. And the Ray family Ray's Auto and Trim. It started out as Ray's Boat Shop, Marine Shop. These were Black folks that actually sold stuff and fixed boats, and they actually went camping. I wasn't finna go camping, but there are Black folks that camp and go outside, right? So these are some people and things and places and institutions that are still in the Hollywood neighborhood, though much of the neighborhood, when I get into the schooling aspect, this Hollywood school doesn't exist anymore. The Bethune Middle School doesn't exist anymore. The buildings exist, but because the school structure changed under Bobby Jindal, those names, that history is now gone. It's gone. Bethune Middle School, the name from Mary McLeod Bethune is gone. Built in 1950 the Booker T. Washington High School in Shreveport, and it is still there. Thank goodness. Moving on. The Progenic Voice is inclusive of blood kin and extended kinship ties based on where she resides geographically, ancestrally, and spiritually at certain points along the Black cultural continuum. The continuum for this presentation is the late 1940s and into the late 1950s in Louisiana. The African mythos, the original drama that explains how we should live, is manifested in the principles, actions, and values that build on a previously laid foundation that demonstrates that there is an inheritance passed along from the past into the present and into the future. Black consciousness manifested in the Black feminine is part of the definition of we, as I will use it in my research. It is designed to put the Black feminine voice in the center of our understanding of race. When I say race, I mean Black people. Place, when I say place, I mean the Hollywood neighborhood. And space, when I say space, I mean Western geography, thought, and consciousness. To be clear, we exist in this space as contradictions, fully aware that our being exists in contradiction to accepted narratives that are born out of accepted Judeo-Christian mythos. The Black feminine comes out of and gave birth to an alternative narrative that explains our being, Black and female, our essence. Black defined as Black defines human or darkness, defines daylight or dusk, defines dawn, and our concept of ourselves. The Black feminine human consciousness in communal arrangement with self as other, while in constant motion, not in competition or tension with each other, but in concert and communion with each other, physical and spiritual to eternal, subject and object to entity, universal and particular to individual, individual and collective to communal. The Black feminine is a contradiction moving inside of a contradiction. It is not supposed to exist, yet it does. In that she exists, she has consciousness and is conscious of her consciousness. Under these conditions, U.S. space inside of Western consciousness, she has been defined by her being omitted, by her being deemed insignificant, by her absence, while simultaneously knowing she is being defined by others, while those same others are being dependent on her, in the same way that dawn depends on dusk, light on dark, and darkness on daylight. She knows she cannot be dismissed, cannot allow herself to be dismissed, or made to believe that she holds no significance to how the world must function for life to exist. This goes far beyond the womb and the biological necessity of women for life to happen. This speaks to how the woman is, quote, at the core of the African mythos of Asar, Aset, and Heru, and has been removed from the core of the Western mythos of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. I argue that the Black feminine and the African origin stories are present in the social order and structure of the Hollywood neighborhood, even as it existed inside of Western spaces and places, even when portions of those places were relegated to be turned into Black places where we lived, learned, practiced liberty, labored, and had leisure time. This brings us back to the 5 areas, which is actually 7, but the 5 areas of my research are those areas that begin with L and numbers Well, I'll break it down later. But this brings us back to the 5 areas of my research and Black cultural place in Shreveport's Hollywood neighborhood on Ledbetter Street in 1945 to 1985, with a focus on 1950 to 1960. And so as documented through writings by my maternal grandmother, Mrs. Goldleana Harris Mosley Abraham. Darkness. Quote, African women reside at the core rather than the periphery of social order. She is, quote, Blackness as a quality of sensibility and not a reaction to whiteness. She lives and functions within Western consciousness, so she must respond to whiteness, but she does not react to whiteness as the foundation to her existence. She operates in relation to whiteness based on her proximity to it. She does not need to be in competition with it. She exists independent and interdependent of it based on her human experience and her spiritual experiences with consciousness and its transformational nature. In other words, we embrace, understand, and practice our constant becoming, just as darkness is always on its way in the form of what we call the night, a phenomenon outside of human control, but is symbolic of human experience and human consciousness. Thank you. So what I need help with, and writing these women into the center and keeping them there. Every time I write or start to write about these Black women, starting with my grandmother, moving to my mother, and extending out to other Black women in my neighborhood, because they were the keepers of the documents that I use, they start to disappear. So this is a metaphorical search party. I need you to help me figure out how to keep Black women at the center of my research. Questions, comments?
So I have a couple of clarifying questions. So is it that they're disappearing by them not including themselves like in the diary? Like, so how are they disappearing?
They're disappearing in my consciousness as the researcher and the writer. Okay, so they're there, right? And they're there because these documents are here and they're in the stories and their names are there. But when I go to start writing and crafting what I need to say, all of a sudden other things become more important and they start shifting and moving. And I can't seem to build everything. I'm trying to build things around them. And maybe around is the wrong preposition. I don't know. But an example I can give you is when I was doing research at LSUS in Shreveport, I started going down this rabbit hole of talking about Negro schools and white schools and how blatant the segregation was. And all of a sudden I started becoming more interested in the assistant superintendent of the schools who actually came from another part of the state of the country into Louisiana. And he started doing all this work for rural schools. He was in charge of Negro schools. And he started doing all this work. And I was like, oh, he's so interesting. And poof, she wasn't at the center anymore. So I don't know if it's me and my inability to be grounded more in women's, in feminist theory. I don't know if it's just me, and I don't know if I'm battling ADHD and just can't remain focused. Yeah, hang up. I forgot to turn it off. Sorry. I don't know what that is. Like, why? And maybe I'm making a mountain out of molehill. Yeah. So did I? I'm sorry.
Were you?
Yeah, so,
Did that make sense? No.
Okay.
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 Yeah, so, I see the value. It's necessary, it's needed in the work. And what's coming to mind is, since it is so rooted in the the experiential, this Black women's experiential,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that it would probably even be important to include some Black women Southern writers. And the first comes to mind is Zora Neale Hurston. Because as you talked about place and you talked about this migration, and from the actual lived experiences of your grandmother and other Black women in your family, she talks about that, and she does it in a way that honors that voice, and recognizes what the migrations across the South were, from rural to city, from city to rural. And I think even sometimes in like Black literary canons, Zora Neale Hurston is not as much privileged because of that Southern perspective. And so I hear from your project, you're trying to privilege the Southern aspect and identity in that placehood. And so probably pairing this with literature and some other Black Southern women writers who also can give you a language to work with. And it's very, because some of it is because we are close to the subject matter, and it's feeling, it's emotional, and to channel some of that in literature where that emotion can be sparsed out will help give you, and even probably, as you said, they're disappearing in your mind and in your frame as you are trying to remember and to write and chronicle. Reading about that from someone who they've constructed it already in a narrative can keep that memory going for you.
That's why it was that dialogue at the beginning that I did between me and my grandmother, though she's dead, because I hear these voices, right?
Yeah.
And Hegel's been in my head. I never met him, but he's floating in my head. So I know my grandmother's in my head. It was like, I'm gonna drown him out and just listen to my grandmother, right? And so that became important for me to do and important to share, though I didn't know. I'm not saying that that's going to be a part of my dissertation.
Right.
I'm just saying that this is something that I need to do to get to that part of writing my dissertation.
Right.
And Dr. Freeman Marshall is my co-chair now, and our meetings. So the Zora definitely is coming.
Good, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
I was going to say that I totally understand where you're coming from. I like this. I think I've worded it as something that kids like being distracted by like a shiny object and you see like, ooh, look at this, and then you go down a rabbit hole. And I'm wondering with the example that you gave at the beginning with the conversation with your grandmother, I'm not sure how you went about it in your research, but maybe with the different places that you had alluded to in the Ira Berlin quote that you had up there, that maybe you consider the voices of the women in your family with those particular experiences with those places, like kind of like you did with the example of the Negro Day Fair at Shreveport, and you centered that how your brother's experience with like the photo and whatnot, and maybe you just did that as a recurrent thing throughout with your paper. Maybe you would like the fear or the anxieties of the person they're centering the black women.
And you mean like in dissertation phase, or just getting to the process of writing? Keep that centered in all of those areas, because that's two different things to me. Like the final project, because my brain tends to think of in the terms of goal, but in the writing process as well, I need those images and those voices and that kind of thing as well. Is that what you were saying?
I didn't think about it in that way too much, to be honest. So I'm not sure. I don't have to go much further because I'm just on it. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. No. Why you apologize?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
So I think in terms of like narrator.
Okay.
And so like what was very strong was the fair. And so thinking about like through the lens of your mom of Helen, how is Helen navigating that space? You know, you mentioned Stamps at the beginning. I didn't read all of the books, but I know that it's broken down in that there's different people that serve as like a guide or a narrator through the chapters. I know one of the chapters, like Angela Davis, is kind of like a lens through where you look. And so maybe that could be helpful. I remember about a couple of weeks ago, the Black Cultural Center had Adrian Miller or something like that. Like he, the poet laureate for Indiana, the second Black poet laureate Indiana has had in its history. And so he just did this book on Jack Johnson, and he talked about the struggle very similar to what you had about how there was many times where he wanted to write these forms of poems and stories, and his issue was that he was trying to write it through the lens of Jack Johnson, because everybody had written about Jack Johnson, had imposed their thoughts on him, but it was never really his voice. And so he wrestled for years on how did he keep it Jack Johnson, especially in some moments that were very tough and complicated. And he said he felt some of himself coming through where he wanted Jack Johnson to apologize, and he said, but Jack Johnson never did apologize. And based upon his thoughts at that time, he would not have apologized. So I don't know if maybe reaching out to him, it's like, what was the process of like how to make sure that Jack Johnson's voice was centered. That's kind of what I was thinking about as I was hearing you with that debate, but also kind of thinking about it as a narrator, because I also struggle with the having to write but I got the dissertation I need to complete. Now my mind is kind of like in two different spaces as that happens. And so with the food truck owners, I was struck by the picture that had the food trailer in it. So I zeroed in on that. But I think of like when I'm trying now to write about each food truck owner, I'm trying to think about if they wrote it themselves, what would it sound like? And not me trying to write their story. And so sometimes when I write, it comes out as like but it's not like I as in Ariel. But
that's why I want to use
Patrick.
we. Yeah, that's why I want to use the pronoun we and the pronoun our, because on that continuum, this is the part that's very difficult for me to explain. So please just bear with me for a second. There's a line in the Nat Turner movie when he says we need something about our unborn, right? Our unborn will something, right? The notion of, or the idea, or the whatever of the unborn being a part of our consciousness. That is something that I'm struggling. Like, how conscious was my grandmother of the unborn, of that she would have 2 daughters and a son, that her children would have children? Is that something that we all as human beings navigate, negotiate, wrestle with as it relates to inheritance? The questions about how did I get here? How did I get to this moment, right? How did I get to Purdue? There's a wealth of things that come before this moment. And it takes me back to Hegel and the career work that Pinar does as well, in the curriculum part of how I teach about this stuff, right? It's like we have this autobiographical moment where we have to look at ourselves. But part of that autobiographical moment has to do with the past. And so when I put Pinar in conversation with Elaine Locke for some previous writings, and looking at the Carrere method and cultural pluralism, and looking at adult education, it's like, how conscious are we of the past, the present, and the future? Is that, I don't know what to do with that, but it's a part of the psyche questions. Like, what were they thinking? I mean, that's a question that I ask. It's like, this is Jim Crow segregation, and you still having babies. Why? You know that if you do anything that steps outside of the bounds of acceptable conduct, you could be killed. But you still living. You still trying to buy that lot. You still making babies. You still going to church. You still praising God. You still doing all these things, knowing that the surroundings, your whole neighborhood could be wiped out if somebody from your neighborhood goes out and does something to somebody.
But
that was the reality.
Babies during enslavement.
True, I get it. But why? But that's the point.
Because they were not psychically enslaved. But so I want to make a couple of comments. So when you were talking about the preposition, you were talking about putting the stories around. And so I would say one of the reasons you're losing it is because you're putting the stories around them
Mhm.
instead of through them. So I think that would be a helpful way of thinking about it if you're concerned about losing it. Because if it's through them, then they're always going to be in the center.
Mhm.
I would also say what you were just talking about sounded to me like ancestral memory, not Hegel. So I would say you're dealing with.
It's more Barbara Tier's work. I didn't go in depth with her, but yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, I'm saying you're dealing with African people. I would be looking at some African sources. The other thing is, as you're talking, I really don't know what your project is. And so I would want to know what is your main point. And then if you're telling this through these women, what is their perspective on your main point? And I think that is how you keep them centered in your project.
Okay. So one of the main points that I'm trying to get to is that we talk a lot about Black spaces and Black neighborhoods as these places where we were during Jim Crow segregation, but do we talk about how people were actually going about their day-to-day lived experiences? So that is what I'm trying to document through these obituaries and journals and so forth and so on, right? And the perspective, the women were, it was not my intention to go to look at women. It was an epiphany, like, wait a minute. These were the women, I wouldn't have these documents if it not for the women folk that were doing this work. And then when I read deeper into the journals and realized who was doing the saving of the obituaries, then I was like, okay, well, what is this? Why is this missing? So is it because we all have been taught to just not pay attention? What are the absences? So that's what I'm trying to do. Because I've always been race-centered, never woman-centered. And I know they're not, Black race and gender is there, that's the intersection, but I've always been honing in on what was it like racially and not necessarily looking at masculine or feminine or the gendered aspects of race.
Okay, so what is this everyday living telling you? What is the significance of it?
So it's telling me that there was a freedom, but the freedom has not been defined for me, and I don't know if it's been defined for other people. Because what freedom, what liberation looks like, feels like, sounds like, what liberation is what I'm trying to get to and what I'm trying to convey. And that's why the question in Leonard Harris's Insurrectionist Ethics is crucial. It's like, is it my ethical duty to liberate myself from these forms of oppression, whether it be slavery, Jim Crow, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be whatever? What is my ethical obligation to myself as a Black woman? Not just as a woman, not just as Black, but as a Black woman. So that's why I say liberation, it's all in there. So it's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you looked at Clenore Hudson Williams' Africana womanism?
Yes, not in depth, so not her specifically.
Because she has a different perspective than what you see in Black feminism, where she does very much put race and community and women like all together in a very different way. So that might work well for you. That's not what I do, but it could be helpful for your project. So I would suggest looking at that. And piggybacking off of what Dr. Nix was saying about how literature might be useful. There is a book on freedom narratives. Oh gosh. The title is escaping me right now, but send me an email because it's on my bookshelf.
Okay.
And I'll give you that because it talks about liberating narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that language and some of the sources that are used in there might be helpful for you. And now I'm gonna shut up.
Last question, because we're over time by 6 minutes so far. Any other suggestions or comments or anything?
So
Yes.
I want to add, so because you put your slide up and, are you trying to situate all 7 of those?
No, it's actually 5.
Okay.
It's actually
Well,
5.
Well, because what I was
This is just the 7 steps. This is, I look at schooling, housing, labor, worship, and leisure.
Because what I was gonna say is, from what I hear, even from what you presented in the journal, is the emphasis on the schooling and learning. And I was gonna, literacy is really what comes out to me. And I think if you kind of focus on maybe one or 2, instead of trying to do all, because obviously it's going to speak to different pieces, but to really focus in on maybe 1 or 2, and the one that hears literacy, because you're dealing with a journal. And what does it mean to be a Black woman journaling, and exhibiting this level of literacy and passing that on. So, and you're using this now as a subject, or as a text. So literacy, I would say, then that ties into your educational focus.
Right.
And so I think that will help you as well, instead of trying to tackle so much. But I think you're trying to make it so theoretical and rooted in these other theories. And you have a wealth right there that you can just use. You don't have to tackle everything, just to focus in on one.
Part of that theoretical, is because I've been beating myself up and trying to make sure that, they're going to see this as some kind of vanity project for my dissertation and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to, and the whole thing about, is it rigorous and this and I know it needs to be academic, but I get frustrated with that. But it is important. It's valid. It's a valid point. It's a valid argument. But I just think that with the names of things being changed or disappearing in the neighborhood I grew up in, that means that history is no longer there. And if I have the memory and access to information, I need to document that, not just for my family and the people in my neighborhood, but also for the city of Shreveport and North Louisiana.
Right.
Because as I was doing my research this past summer, one of the ladies at the museum said, Purdue, we don't hardly have any information whatsoever on Black life and Black neighborhoods in North Louisiana. All the grants go to South Louisiana. We hardly have any. And I was like, wow, whoa, okay. I wasn't expecting all of that, right? And here I know people with tons of documents, houses full of documents and stuff, and there's nowhere for them to place that stuff and for us to go and stuff. So it's almost like I do feel like it's somewhat of an academic extension to the work that my grandmother did by writing down her life, and the work that my mother did. And here I am doing another kind of work that can also benefit, Black folk, right? The ones in my immediate spheres of, influence. So, yeah. Special thank you. I don't know if they're here on Facebook or not, but Miss Johnny Barnes, thank you. Miss Kermit Anderson-Diggs, thank you. Miss Lois Bryant Hughes and her children, the Ray family, Aunt Roxy, Aunt Jamesetta, Aunt Erlene, Aunt Nancy, Uncle Booker, all my cousins, my sisters and brothers who constantly take care of me and my child. Thank you. Hey, Andre in Italy. Hey, and everybody. Mwah. Yeah. Okay. Done. And I only held you 10 minutes over. Thank you all for taking the time to come. And please, if you have any ideas after the fact, shoot me an email, Anders50, ANDERS50 @purdue.edu. Anything, just anything, any thoughts after the fact. I'd appreciate it. Okay. Naja, how do you save this? End stream. It's right there.
Yeah, in stream and it'll automatically save.
It's saving.